Welcome to Dolby Creator Talks. This is a show about how artists use technology to tell their stories, and I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. Today we welcome back to the show the all-star sound team behind Wicked for Good. The last time we spoke to this team was before they were all nominated for the Academy Award for Wicked Part 1, and I am very excited to have them all back to discuss the new film. Joining us today is production sound mixer Simon Hayes, supervising sound editor Nancy Nugent-Title, supervising sound editor, sound designer, and re-recording mixer Jon Marquis, re-recording mixer Andy Nelson, and supervising music editor Jack Dolman. This is actually our second conversation about Wicked for Good. A few days ago, we posted a really fun talk we had with the film's director, Jon M. Chu, and cinematographer Alice Brooks. You should definitely check that one out if you haven't already. Now, if you've seen the film, you know that it starts off from the very beginning with an incredible sound moment. I'm speaking, of course, about that fantastic sequence of chaos and flybys as Elphaba frees the animals being forced to lay bricks for the yellow brick road. At first, she is only heard, not really seen, and she's an ominous moment of menace for the citizens of Oz as the sounds of her flying envelop the audience. So that's exactly where I wanted to start today's conversation, by asking the team about their approach to that opening sequence and all the aerial sequences throughout the film, including those incredibly visceral scenes with the flying monkeys. Here's sound supervisor Jon Marquis.
It's a complicated scene. There's just a lot happening. It's a dense story-wise, dense timing-wise. There's a lot of information coming at you. So it was kind of one of the, in a similar sense, we were dealing with that in part one as well. The opening scene was just a lot of info for the audience to kind of take in. So it was one of the scenes that we definitely kind of had many passes on, just refining passes, just getting the broad strokes first of where are the story points, what's the emotional, where's the audience supposed to resonate emotionally with in this moment. And so, yeah, a lot of it was dictated beautifully by the way Jon and Myron Kirstein cut it. You know, the timing, the pacing of all that kind of allowed us to be dictated sonically by what we're seeing on the screen.
That's a good question, Glenn, because to start the film, when you think about the way the last one ended with such a big climax, and so you go into this, and I think that the thing was when I watched it and we talked about this opening, we wanted to feel that we were just landing in Oz on an everyday thing. It was like day at the factory. They were out there busy, just laying down the bricks, doing their thing, and then suddenly they were interrupted. So it was a kind of a way for us for sound to say, how can we just make this a little mundane, a little ordinary, until suddenly, you know, she's above us. So it was fun for Jon Marquis because he could actually play with the surrounds and the Atmos sound to get her to move around. In the air. And for me, with the orchestrally, you know, there's a tendency to sort of say, well, okay, so it's our first opening piece of music from John Powell, and how do we go into this? But in fact, it was about reducing things, to be honest, Glenn. It was like we threw everything in it, and then we said, okay, now we have to start to reduce and make it a bit mundane. And of course, the lovely moment is when we cut to her face when she lands, and we hear the big theme kick in, and it's fun to hear people applause at that moment. So I think that's what we were kind of aiming for, was start a little bit mundane and then go to the big moment. And then from then on, of course, we're into the main title and we're off.
And Jack, what's happening musically in that opening, in that first sequence?
Well, you know, everything is leading to Elphaba's reveal. That was really our challenge collectively from a sonic perspective, is there are so many beats that happen before that moment where she raises her head and we see her smirking there for the first time. And so we knew we had to build through those moments. But when she is revealed, we hear that iconic Wicked Witch theme, bum, 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 which we knew from an early point in creating Wicked for Good that was the theme we wanted to put there. It's iconic. It's recognizable. We were hoping for that fist pumping moment from the audience. Like, she's back. This was our superhero moment, really. She's even got a cape. I mean, what could be more superhero than that? So, but the challenge was there are so many action beats that happen, whether it's the the bricklaying machine and the bison kind of sending it out of control, whether it's Elphaba in the sky, the whip crack, all these things were important to hit, but we knew we had to build to that moment. So it was really an exercise in discipline to allow for that moment to hit, but not lose the sort of dynamic range of everything that happens before.
Yeah, and you talk about it as a fist pump moment, but I got to say, like, my audience was so wired. Like, almost after every number, they burst into applause. It was like this was a very satisfying journey for the audience in this film. But that being said, this is a very different film than Wicked Part 1. It's much darker in tone. Obviously, you know, a lot of kind of what is driving the energy of the first film is the interplay of Elphaba and Glenda together, and they're separated for most of this film. So I'm kind of curious for you know, Jack and Jon and Nancy, for you all to talk about the different approach to the track in this film, given that the tone of the film is so different.
It was beautifully orchestrated with regard to the contrasting moments of these huge set piece designs that are full range, full frequency, that, you know, delivering massive emotional power. The kind of trick and interesting part of that is to seeing the contrast then with these small, seemingly small, minimal pieces that are very quiet, but just as emotionally charged and packed. It's hard for me, it's like we want to talk about the emotional content of it being darker or more mature and all this. I mean, which is, I guess, true, but to me, it's like the trajectory was set in Part 1, where we were on this emotional journey that just didn't stop. You know, it led into Part 2, which then is just everything's ratcheted up. Everything's being delivered in Part 2, so the emotions are higher. The you know, the yearning, the heartbreak, all the things we're feeling are just so deeper and so much more immediate.
I think it was pretty easy for us to take our cues from, you know, every other department, and we had developed the vocabulary, you know, of what Oz sounded like in Part 1, and just continued on that trajectory. But you can even see that the actors' voices they're singing in a different tone. They're older. They're, you know, everything's changed. The lighting has changed. The way that they've shot it has changed. Like, and we just followed that blueprint sonically.
Yeah, I think that, you know, in the first film, world building, set pieces, youthful, exuberance, those were all our sort of keywords and what we were leaning towards with the sound and music. On movie 2, we'd already laid that foundation. And so emotion really became our superpower on this one. We were, you know, the character's emotion always guides the sonic world of each scene. And when you know you're leading towards the song For Good, which is as deeply emotional and compelling and heartbreaking as any song can get, and it represents the culmination of their relationship, you just have to follow the characters and follow what Jon Chu's vision is for each of these scenes leading up to it. So I'm not sure if darker is the right word as much as just internal, real, and deeply emotional. And we just followed that and leaned into it and weren't afraid of it. I think that was the key, is not to be afraid of the fact that this is a grown-up, emotional, and beautifully compelling story.
And Simon, I'm kind of curious how that affected your work as well. You know, Elphaba and Glenda, they're very alone in this film in their own way. And while, you know, there are certainly some big show-stopping numbers and they each have their moments when they belt, there's some really beautiful, very intimate, emotional singing moments for the both of them, especially in the two new songs, which I want to talk more about as we get into it. But for you, Simon, your process of capturing the vocals on set, and again, you know, the thing we have to bear in mind is that they're live singing. Tell us about the capture of those more intense, you know, maybe quieter songs.
You know, we lent on the keyboard a lot more in film 2, which gave the actors a real ability to just stop, take a moment, reflect, and really let their acting and their emotions drive the tempo rather than a pre-record. They had the confidence of knowing that the keyboard was there to accompany them. It was never going to lead them. And that really allowed them to weave in and out of dialogue and singing a lot. And I don't know whether you noticed, but they're often coming out of a line of singing straight into a line of dialogue and then back to singing. What both Ari and Cynthia had was a complete confidence that they could do that, and they would still have that support of the keyboard in their IEM. Interestingly, what we did about that, because we're slipping sync all of the time, it's obviously not great for Jack tempo wise, but what we did, we had a kind of a cheat code. And what the cheat code was that we had the keyboard player locked to a click track. So even if Ari and Cynthia didn't have a click track in their IEM, to give them a feeling of complete creative freedom, that keyboard player who was accompanying them, who was just, basically doing a great job of never leading them, he could let them have that reflected moment. He could let them take that breath, where there shouldn't have been a breath, but he always had that click in his ear to kind of keep some kind of integrity for Jack and all of the guys who are going to orchestrate. I mean, a few times I saw in the middle of that, the IEM come out like this, literally as he's playing, to get rid of that click. But a lot of the time, that was our that was our safety net, if you like. Ari and Cynthia didn't know that click was happening because, of course, that would have made them feel like they were getting reined in some way. They had this complete freedom to express themselves in the moment and let their emotions and their acting be the primary priority rather than a rhythm. That's how we did it, just keyboard as much as possible.
I'm just fascinated by that because, it's fairly rare. Well, musicals are rare, but even more rare in musicals to do that much live singing on the set. And then I feel like when people are live singing in musicals, they're really working to, largely to click tracks and pre-records. And so they don't have that kind of freedom. So Jack, how did Simon just kind of teed this up that this, this created, I'm sure, some interesting challenges for you as those tracks came in, and there's a beautiful organicness to that singing, but it doesn't necessarily match what the rest of the elements are.
Well, it is tricky sometimes, but I think what's at the heart of what Simon just described, which by the way is ingenious, and I'm so grateful that they had that idea on set, is that everyone's a musician, really. Everyone's thinking along the lines of what is the musical integrity of these songs, and how can we preserve the structure in a way that allows us to cut things together later. I'm thinking of the example of Glinda, Ariana Grande's aria during Thank Goodness, where everything sort of freezes and she goes into this very internal state and she sings this heartbreakingly honest kind of lyric about where she's found herself. And every one of those takes was a piano accompanied take. They were all slightly different, but the phrasing of the music was similar enough because everyone approached it from that deep musicality. So we were able to take these different chunks of it and put it together in a way that almost didn't require a huge amount of stretching or elastic work because the phrasing was aligned. And whether I actually don't know to this day how many of those were the click track in the piano accompanist's ear or not. All I know is that when we went through the different takes that Myron and Jon were choosing, it allowed us to stitch it together in a way that made a lot of sense musically. And so that when we then had to pass that off to Stephen Schwartz and Stephen Aremus and their team, the click track was fairly musical. In fact, it actually ends up giving you a much more natural musical approach to orchestrate than if it's regimented along to a click track. If you see a conductor conduct a piece of classical music, the tempo is an expression of what they're feeling. And that allows for a much more organic and natural musical performance. So it happened there. It happened in several parts of For Good, which is why it feels so natural and it feels so intimate. So there are challenges to putting that stuff together. But as long as the musical integrity is intact because of this process, it makes it a lot easier and it makes it more natural for sure.
Don't forget, Glenn, we're also dealing with Ari and Cynthia, and they have natural rhythm in their bones. I'm not sure that anyone else could have held that instinctive sync and taken a breath and taken a moment to reflect and then come back in without that click track. So we did have, two of the best artists in the world to be able to use this technique with. And it was in their bones to just know where that sync was, even though they were performing completely freeform.
That's amazing. And then I know that the two films were shot, more or less sequentially, although there were some interesting, checkerboarding sometimes when you Simon, very well, shooting, scenes for movie 2 while you were shooting movie 1 as well. But I know that there were pre-records on the songs as well as the live sung, and then some post-records as well, right? So was that kind of the same model that you had all the pre-records on set as well as in case those elements became necessary?
So here's the thing. When we started, we had everything pre-recorded because honestly, we weren't quite sure, firstly, how much of this Cynthia and Ari could do for 10, 11 hours a day nonstop. That's a big, big vocal commitment. We also didn't know whether someone was going to get a sore throat. We didn't know whether someone was going to get sick. So we had to have that safety net. And when we started shooting, like the first 2 weeks with Jon was very much saying, look, let's do 3 takes live and let's do 3 takes to lip sync. That was the first week. And then Jon was with Myron over the weekend, and it became very clear over the weekend in the cutting room that the live was really working, and it just had something that the pre-record didn't. And so we'd come back and we'd suddenly the next week we'd do 4 takes live and 2 takes to lip sync. The third week we'd do 5 takes live and 1 take to lip sync. And by the time we were kind of a month in, we just didn't do anything to lip sync at all, because I think the more time that Jon spent in the cutting room with Myron, it became clear to him that there was an emotion and an energy in the live recordings that just wasn't present in the pre-records. And also to be able to give the actors this expressive freedom by going in the keyboard. It's not just about the fact that we're recording them live on the set with microphones. It's also all about that tempo and letting the acting and the performance drive the tempo. That's a major part of it.
Well, the star really is our vocal editor, Robin Bainton, who was extraordinarily diligent in going through every possible thing, every possible microphone, getting prepared so that he knew, and working with Nancy, of course, in and out of dialogue all the time, so that we would always be compatible with our microphone choices and things. But you're absolutely right. You've got the pre-record option, you've got the live option, and you've got the sort of post-record. And they had the little recording studio on the set in London so that the Ariana and Cynthia could go off and try a different vocal, knowing what the set was now looking like. And so that you've got all these different permutations. It comes down ultimately, of course, to what Myron Kirstein and Jon Chu choose as they're putting the piece together in the edit room, because clearly once it became apparent from day one that everyone was into doing this live. Clearly, as they were constructing the songs pictorially in the edit room, they were going to be going into the live tracks wherever possible. Certain movements, of course, don't always work, so they'd have to dive into pre-record or even post-record. It didn't matter, but they're really only for little moments where the original recording might not have been as strong as it could have been. But overall, it's nearly always live. And that, of course, is why the seamless in and out of song occurs, because you're going from live dialogue to live vocal. You're not trying to switch like the old days where you'd suddenly go into a completely different sounding vocal track. And we all know those lovely old musicals had that. But obviously nowadays, try not to do that. And the way I mix is I combine the vocal track with the dialogue track. When I'm preparing the mix, I don't even really play the music very much at that moment. I'm much more concerned about going through all the vocals and the dialogue and just making them all occur and feel like they're in one place by adding my own type of room reverb to things or exterior slaps, whatever it takes, which all happen during each song, so that nothing changes between spoken to sung. Then I slide over and start introducing the music to that. And I find that that's our foundation of the entire mix, is the dialogue and the vocal. And then everything now has to start wrapping around that. So it's definitely a combination of a lot of people's work and efforts. And as I say, Robin was a key person to this. But it allowed me a lot of freedom and, to be able to just sort of dive in and out of these tracks and get the very best out of everything.
You lose that physicality, that movement, that realism, that's a huge part of what I think makes this vocal track so special. It's like they're really grounded in the scene, and you can hear it in their vocals.
Yeah, absolutely. And then on a practical level, you have to then get rid of the piano, the keyboard track on set. So, I mean, Simon, was that your magic in the way you mic'd the vocals, or how did you manage to subtract the keyboards?
Oh, Glenn, no one could hear the keyboard unless you had a pair of headphones on or IEMs. The set was silent, and it was as close to a music recording studio as I could make it. Now, as you know, film sets are noisy places, so I had to do a lot of deals. I had to call in a lot of favors with my buddies in special effects. But the only people that could hear the keyboard were people that wanted to hear that in my mix tracks. And so what I would do is I would do what I called my vocal mix, which is what Myron got on mix track 1. And then I would have the music, whether it be keyboard or a pre-recorded Greg Wells track, in mix track 2, so that Myron firstly could split that up. So he basically had an a cappella track of the singing, and then he had a keyboard stroke Greg Wells backing track, which he could use as a mono mix until he wanted to go 7.1 or 5.1 in his cutting room, which happened pretty much when he started getting a scene into shape. But my a cappella mix was pretty quiet. That's why we had Silent Wind built on the set, because I don't know, even if look, No Good Deed, obviously we had big silent wind effects. Silent wind isn't really completely silent, but it just means that we don't have the mechanical wind machines on the set. They're outside the studio walls, and we pipe in the wind. And what that gives Nancy and Robin Bainton, our fantastic vocal engineer, is it gives them a broadband, a kind of which they've got to get rid of off my track. But what that does is it puts wind in the costume and wind in the hair. And even on a very, very emotional song like For Good, we've got leaves being blown on the floor in the background if you have a look at the wide shots. And that's also, I considered kind of fighting against that. But what I realized is that there's a reality in the live vocal, there's a reality in live special effects on the set that don't have to be done in CGI. And if we start leaning on CGI too much visually, it's the equivalent of leaning too much on pre-recorded lip sync acoustically. And so what we're all trying to do really as a collaborative team, the whole movie set, is trying to make as much real as possible, because we know that we're going to be supported by CGI. We know that the choruses are going to be supported by beautiful choral pre-records and re-records. As long as we can get those solos as live as possible, and as much of the environmental wind actually working and it not being CGI, it's kind of like that gives the audience this connection, and they kind of go, okay, I buy this. This is real.
Simon, did you have your keyboard player like in a hermetically sealed pneumatic tube or something? Where was that person?
You know what? It was great because remember, the sets were so huge. So we always had like a place at the back, and me and the music team, that's the other thing. We put the sound and music team all in the same spot. We were working very much as a tight knit one department. There was no demarcation between sound and music. And so, we had the Pro Tools player, the Pro Tools on-set playback player, the keyboard player next to him, me next to them. And it was almost like we had our own little orchestra pit. And And also what we'd be doing was, obviously, when we got to a point in a live keyboard, if we got to a point where we had to have tempo lock because there was a rhythm coming in and we knew we couldn't do that to Jack, what we would do is at a certain bar, everyone would know we're going to crossfade between the keyboard straight into the Pro Tools playback, so that what Ari or Cynthia hear in their IEM is basically a seamless mix across. They, of course, knew exactly what we were going to do and when we were going to do it, but they would have this expressive freedom to emote for the first verse, and then as that bass line comes in, we crossfade in their IEM straight into that Greg Wells magical rhythmic track.
It's so cool because, I'll piggyback on the conversation about the keyboard. Having Simon's separation of all of these elements was crucial editorially, because when you're dealing with these sections that are off click track and they're guided by the instinct of the singer and the on-set piano accompanist, you have to be able to, later in the process, create a click track that can be recorded to once we get to orchestration. So we would have to dance between referencing the piano performance and referencing the vocal performance in order to create this kind of natural average to then click out the song in post to then record it. And without the separation of those elements, it would have been very tricky to do that. Oftentimes I would mute the vocal, just listen to the piano to picture, start to click things out. Robin and I spent a lot of time doing this. And then sometimes we would then mute the piano, listen to the vocal, see where that sits in the click track. And so the result of it was creating a new tempo map that then could be used for the music team to come up with their orchestrations and ultimately record them at Air Studios months later. So an invaluable process there.
See, it's extraordinarily complicated, but obviously, the end results speak for itself. Simon made the great point about there's a seamlessness and an ability to move between spoken dialogue and the sung tracks for these actors. So, I'm curious, Jack and Nancy, what's the interaction between the two of you from an editorial standpoint? Because obviously, you can't say like, well, we have dialogue tracks versus sung music. So you guys must have had a much higher level of interaction than a dialogue editor would normally have with a music editor.
Oh, for sure. That was pretty much between me and Robin Bainton, and we worked through that protocol on movie one and just continued it with movie two. But it just depended on, like, particularly for good. There's a lot of crossover between dialogue and singing. They're going in and out of song a lot, especially in the beginning of that piece. But we kind of took it on a case-by-case basis. There was some times where I would edit something like a chunk, and denoise it in the way that I would, or take out certain, thunks and clicks and everything the way that I'm used to doing and music editors are less used to doing. And then I would ship all of that over to Robin so that he could play his vocal tracks against what I had done, and it would all come out of, one pipe essentially. And sometimes that was less necessary. Sometimes it was more necessary. Sometimes we just needed to make sure we weren't both carrying the same piece of audio. But that was just a lot of communication. But
there's also in the processing of reverbs on this film, I remember quite a bit more requirements to collaborate between dialogue and vocals. A couple examples of that would be during the Thank Goodness sequence. Obviously, they're sort of Ariana and Johnny Bailey, Glinda and Fierro are on the stage with Madame Morrible, and they're presenting the news of their engagement and the ribbon cutting of the Yellow Brick Road to all of the subjects there watching. And so we had to make sure that the reverb treatments coming out of those kind of tannoy style, speakers on set matched. And, that coordination is really important so that when you go into the singing, you're not entering a new kind of reverb space. So there was quite a lot of that kind of back and forth as well.
Yeah, completely. We would either say, hey, have you got to the scene yet? What reverb are you using? And just share that information so that everything was matching up nicely.
So we have two new songs in this film, which were not in the original Broadway show, No Place Like Home and The Girl in the Bubble, that give each of our two lead actresses kind of an amazing moment to step forward. So, Jack, what was the process of working with this new? It must have been quite a thrill for you to work with, Stephen Schwartz and his team on these new songs, and how did you make sure that they kind of fit comfortably within the universe that you guys had already built for the rest of the songs?
Well, yes, it was like Christmas morning, getting new music from Stephen Schwartz. In the case of No Place Like Home, we were working with the piano accompaniment for 2 years. It was the last orchestration that was put together. The question of what the tone of that song should be was up in the air for a long time. We didn't know whether to make it an intimate ballad, to make it a power ballad, to make it a rock song, to make it, there were so many choices. And I think what allowed us to weave it into the world of the rest of the sound and music was to focus on the propulsion that happens in No Place Like Home. Stephen had a lot of driving elements that supported Elphaba's determination that she has during that song. She's sticking to her guns in the face of a lot of adversity. So there were quite a lot of string pulses that he added to it. We also referenced the monkey theme toward the end when the monkeys fly in, and that was all done later to try to accommodate the changes that we were seeing with picture. The monkeys were rendered later on in the process by visual effects, so we had to accommodate that. And in the case of The Girl in the Bubble, this is Glinda at her most vulnerable, perhaps her most truthful in a way. She's realizing these things about herself, and she's sort of looking at the course of her entire life. At one point, she goes into her walk-in closet, and we see all of these symbols and items from her past, from her childhood, from Shiz. And it was very important for the orchestration and for the music to have a childlike, bell-like quality, which we leveraged for Glinda in so many other parts of both movies, that kind of effervescent, twinkly bell sound. But in this case, it needed to have a sort of bittersweetness. So again, it's just following the demands of the character's emotions at any given moment. And I think that both of those songs achieved that really well.
Because they were written by Stephen Schwartz, obviously they had the DNA of the original musical. So from that point of view, it was easy to find the voice of how they should sit. The thing about it was I hadn't had the opportunity, of course, to get used to them. I mean, when I started the first film, and indeed when on this film, I would review the Broadway cast recording over and over to listen to the way the voices were balanced into the band, albeit a smaller pit orchestra in those days, of course. And then on both occasions, for Film One and for Wicked for Good, I was able to go over to London to Air Lyndhurst Studios when they were recording the orchestra specifically for the songs. And so I could kind of immerse myself. Initially, it was so that I could get familiar with the orchestra and to get to know Stephen Schwartz a little bit. On the second film, it was definitely more of that. Plus, here was the two new songs. So for me, it was hearing what the orchestration was going to be like, discussing things with Stephen and Jack. We would talk about how these things were going to be integrated and balanced. So it was a learning curve because they were new, but because they had the DNA of the original feel of the musical, it wasn't a huge thing for me to figure out. It was just, it's very much dictated by the pace and style of where they were within the scene or the reel of the movie that they lived in.
Yeah. You mentioned The Girl in the Bubble, and I just wanted to focus for a moment on what to me is a kind of an amazing sound moment in that number. There's one part of the sequence where we almost basically go to silence, and this kind of amazing moment of contemplation that comes in. Now, I understand from a comment that Jon M. Chu made that was actually a decision that got made fairly late in post-production with Myron, the picture editor. So can you talk about that? I'm just intrigued by how that moment kind of, because it's so important, how that moment became crafted that way.
Well, Jon and Myron are very reactive filmmakers. They like to experiment. They like to try things. And so that was something that came in late. We just come from Witch Hunters March, and loud, bellowing crowds and, full range. And it was just kind of one of these moments that both Jon and Myron were like, and Myron went back and I believe he recut a little bit at the head of that to give us some more space.
There was a different sequence of events in Glinda's awakening, to her conscience. So things happened originally for a long time in a slightly different order, which meant that we didn't go from March of the Witch Hunters right to Girl in the Bubble, but they made this change so that we could have this like very exciting dynamic, shift when she shuts the door. And actually, when she shuts the door, originally she was starting to sing a song that either ending a lyric or starting a lyric, and we ADR'd her just doing some deep breathing there at the door instead. So it's a little nugget behind the curtain.
One of the things that Jon Chu really challenges us with is silence, is minimalism, and coming to places where the audience has no choice but to lean so far in that you almost wonder whether they're going to make it, and the beginning of Girl in the Bubble is such a great example of that we follow her across the room. She walks to the mirror. We hear the crowd receding outside. We hear her shuffling to the mirror, and then everything stops. And it allows you to just go so far deep into what she's experiencing that when she finally starts to sing, you're in it. And I really value the risks that Jon takes when it comes to that sort of approach. They always pay off really well.
I think it's really easy to focus on Stephen Schwartz's extraordinary songs, when we're talking about Wicked. But John Powell's score is also really, really important. And for both of these films, but even more so, I feel, in Wicked for Good. So, I mean, Jack, both of these elements pass through your hands before they come to the stage. So can you talk a little bit about kind of your process of working with, Stephen's songs, Jon's score, and obviously all these things have to feel like they're sitting in the same kind of cinematic universe.
Jon Powell really had his hands full on this one. We knew that the score was going to be an incredibly important part of telling the story. It's a musical drama after all, right? And it needs all of the arcs of a convincing drama, and so much of that comes through the heartbeat of the score. When it comes to the interplay between the songs and the score, we're so lucky that we recorded all of the music with the same group of musicians in London on the same instruments. I always like to point out because that's important, and we were able to use the similarities sonically between those two recordings really masterfully to get in and out of the songs. One specific example that I was really proud of is when we go into For Good, it's coming out of a very sort of stark and intimate piece of score from Jon Powell with the two girls there at the castle. And one thing that Andy Nelson, who came to all of our scoring sessions of the songs, by the way, which is very rare for a re-recording mixer to be there with us in London, he took me aside in the room and said, I have a feeling that the beginning of For Good is too heavy orchestrally. And he made the suggestion to reduce the number of musicians that we used at the beginning of that song to almost only 3, I think it was 3 players per string part, to give it that stark fragility. And that made all the difference, and it allowed us to hand off from Jon's very intimate score into the song in a way that felt almost inevitable. Playing with the orchestrations and the recordings and the players and giving them the freedom to discover ways to tie everything together was a big part of how we sort of melded both worlds.
I was really happy to go to those sessions. I felt that it was very much my role. It wasn't a requirement by any means of the job, but I just put myself out there and suggested that I would love to be part of that. And everyone agreed that that could happen. So I was able to go. Phenomenally important. Look, for me, and as I say, on the first film, it was initially to get to spend time and listen and talk to Stephen Schwartz, because I thought it was really important to get his viewpoint on all this, how we balance things. But it instructs me a lot. So when we were there on Wicked for Good, there was a moment, a couple of times on the previous film when we've been recording something in the studio, Stephen Schwartz would lean over to me and sort of say, are we okay with the woodwinds there? Because he was trying to avoid me having to dip the music to allow the vocal. he wanted to make sure the vocal could, the music could live with the vocal without me having to do too much manipulation internally. So we would have these conversations about, should the oboe come in a bit later? Are you okay with those levels and things like that, which was wonderful. I mean, it was fantastic for me to be that involved. When they started doing For Good, which of course is, the real sort of emotional climax of this film, it was fully orchestrated initially, and we started recording, and actually Jack came over to me and said exactly the words I just said, like, is the oboe going to be a problem here? And I said to him, I think in my opinion, we have a bigger problem. And that is that for this moment in the song and for the film, I said, if the orchestra is going to be this sort of big, I'm going to have to, my feeling is I need to hold it way back. And it will sound like I'm holding it way back. So I said, I actually think it would be lovely if there was a way to start it in a much thinner way. And obviously I was thinking, God, who am I to say this with Stephen Schwartz in the room? Truly, I was like, oh boy. But they took it, and I think Jack mentioned it to Stephen. Stephen more or less said, I think that's a good idea. Maybe, I was thinking the same sort of thing. And they managed to fit it into the schedule, which was tight, to actually do the first verse in a much simpler style. Clearly, they needed the bigger orchestration for the album, because it would have been a little too thin for the album, for sure. But I just, in my gut told me that this was going to sit better in the movie if it was really, really underneath Ariana's vocal for that first pass. So yes, I felt that was a little minor victory, but I really think it paid off, because I think it works beautifully in the movie.
I want to talk about there's some great comedic moments in this film, and often they're coming from Glenda's character. And one of my favorite recurring moments is her bubble, and this thing that we find out, which is the bubble is engineered to cover the fact that she can't really do that much magic. So, Jon, I'm curious for you from a sound design perspective. Tell me about how the approach to the bubble, and it seems like such a light touch, but it's a very funny element.
This is true. I mean, the thing that I got a kick out of was just the fact of, like, how can we make this thing that's supposedly so fantastical and magic to all the subjects of Oz? How can we make it like the sound of it can't be magic? You know what I mean? Like, it's got to be almost comedically in the opposite direction. She stomps on this mechanical device that, of course, is still Ozian in nature. It has like a musical ring and tonality to it, but it's her hitting a button. And yeah, I mean, we just had a lot of fun with the idea of, like, what would a giant bubble sound like, And so it's just kind of experimenting with those fun little sounds that seemingly are mundane, but aren't, when you kind of blow them up and make them larger than life. And the real icing on the cake, of course, is the contrast in the muffled dialogue. I mean, that's the part that really makes you laugh. It's like she's behind this wall of bubble and she's all muffled, and it's just kind of like a 1, 2, 3 punch. With that, it was perfect timing, and of course, it's Ari's delivery. All these things add up to a really fun moment. But I love the bubble as well. It's really fun.
Well, speaking of levity, there was a great moment in the film where Elphaba says, for the first time, "I feel wicked," which I have to say, when in the audience, my audience went crazy for that line. That was a huge audience response line. So, Nancy, I know that line came up in your ADR sessions. Tell us about that.
Yeah, we had we did not have to shoot, thanks to Simon, huge deal of ADR for either movie. But I had one session with Cynthia. She came in and she specifically said, I don't see that line on the cue sheet. For the first time, I feel wicked. It's very intimate. It's very close to, it's very softly spoken, and she's, very close to Johnny Bailey. And I said, oh, we don't have to shoot it. It's fine. And she was like, oh my God, thank God. I thought, even on set, I thought for sure I was going to have to loop that line just because of the difficulty in capturing something that quiet. And Jon Chu was there, and he said, well, thanks to Nancy and Simon and everybody's work, you don't have to. And she was just eternally grateful. That's always a wonderful, wonderful moment when you don't have to ask an actor to re-perform something that emotional. No, it's never, no one ever wants to do it. So to not even have to ask is always great. And she specifically called that out.
You know, one of my golden rules, Glenn, is to never ask the actors to speak up. I will always find a way to mic something, to get in close with the mic, because I really think that if they want to go low, it's for a reason. And there's an emotion and a depth in allowing them to have that dynamic range that really resonates and makes things feel more real. That whole sequence with her and Johnny together was very, very low. And that particular line as well, I really feel wicked now was very low. And I can remember thinking to myself, hey, am I going to be okay? But honestly, it was shot so tight. We had literally if you could see the safety and the boom mic was kissing the safety line on the top of the camera frame. We also had, lav mics just out the bottom of the frame outside the costume, because when you're shooting tight, I'll often pull the lav out of the costume so that we don't have any clothing rustle that Nancy has to try and remove. And so what I'm trying to give Nancy is just a wealth of incredibly closely mic'd dialogue. The other thing that was my rule for Wicked was I wasn't putting any air around the mics at all, because I knew that we were weaving in and out of singing so often. And of course, singing has to be close mic'd. And so what I didn't want to do was to start putting camera perspective and any kind of room around the boom mics or the lav mics. I just wanted it all to sound as close as possible, so that transition from singing to spoken dialogue sounded as natural as possible, and there wasn't ever a perspective change.
This is amazing. I feel like you guys are giving us a masterclass on handling dialogue and capturing on set. This is fantastic. Really, really amazingly well done. Well, obviously on Wicked Films, magical transformations are a hugely important element, and we've got some great ones in this film. Honestly, I think my favorite is the transformation of Bach into the Tin Man. Jon, tell us a little bit about the sound design of the Tin Man, how you approached that, and what was the sort of like your philosophy of what that character was, and specifically that transformation should sound like.
I think back to hearing the little oil can from The Wizard of Oz. You've got these little iconic little sonic signatures and things like that. I remember from my childhood, and it's just, you kind of pinch yourself. You're like, here I am. I'm getting the opportunity to work with the Tin Man. You want to stay focused on the wonder and the amazement and the mystery of all this, and not turn into like some kind of scary, oddly grotesque kind of like thing, which is happening. It's a moment. She's saving him in the only way she knows how to save him. And so it's an act of love. It's an act of protection, all this kind of stuff. And so we're trying to keep it soft and keep it vulnerable in that way. But at the same time, we need to kind of like have the power of like the unknown mystery of Elphaba and how she's able to accomplish her magic. And so, we kind of flash into a bit of a detached, subjective kind of moment where we see her casting the spell, and we're washed in reverb as we don't really know what's happening with Bach. We see him knocking things over, the metal, the tin, the trays and things around the place. So we're washing that out, giving a sense that something is happening. But it was really just kind of about playing the musicality. Jon really had an idea of like wanting to kind of like the brutality and the coarseness or roughness of metal, that it's not necessarily beautiful and all this kind of stuff. We want to play up some of the rusty sounds and the clunkiness of it.
And then, of course, Dorothy appears in the film, and that's a very important thematic element for us in the second movie. And we have the iconic tornado sequence. And I'm kind of curious: was there any kind of conversation? Did you mentioned sort of the Tin Man sound from the original film? Was there any discussion? Did you think is there a callback to the sound of that original tornado from the 1939 film and what you wanted to do?
Only in a sense of like a memory. Like I didn't sit there and study the sounds or go back and do any research. I just kind of like thought about like when I think of these old tornado sounds or just something. And so we kind of had these almost like really pitched down horn wind up, like almost like tornado siren kind of like aspects to it that kind of had a winding tonal quality to them that were just very deep. We were leaning way more into playing it a bit more subjectively and a bit more emotionally, as opposed to the literal there's definitely literal factors of some debris and things like that, but the power and ferocity of the tornadoes all living in this low end, and then this undulating, bending kind of tonal sound that kind of lets you know that it's alive, and it's a bit more than just your typical cyclone. So yeah, and Jon was very much leaning into that as well. Like let's push the tonal aspect of it, and make it more interesting, hopefully.
It's an amazing, obviously you're on the Dolby podcast. That is an amazing moment in Dolby Atmos. And you use Atmos very, very powerfully in the film. Just for the audience who is interested in paying attention to that, Jon, what are some of the standout Dolby Atmos moments for you in the mix?
There's so many. I mean, whenever we're flying the monkeys, there's always, we're dealing with things that are above our heads. We're also in the wizard's lair where there's gears happening all around. We've got some stuff that happens during Wonderful for sure, where he's in the rafters doing things. The tornado it's the power with Atmos is, from my perspective, is it's limited use, not using it all over the place, but just using it in very sparse areas. So that way, when you use it, it's really, really is way more effective and just kind of like blossoms particular scenes. And the way Andy uses it is just beautiful. Like he just has an amazing spread that just kind of hugs the screen and just frees up the entire screen channels for dialogue and sound effects. And so it's this real interesting trick that allows you to get all the music that you want to hear, but also all the detail and the specifics of what's happening on screen, sound effect wise and dialogue wise.
So if I'm talking about dialogue initially, dialogue and vocals, I mean, what I do is I try and create a sense of, as I say, with a room, I would build a reverb that allows me to go across the screen and out to the sides. I don't use really the overheads for those types of things because I want to keep it more grounded. But the truth of the matter is, it's a subtle effect. It's never meant to be perceived. But it is there, and it just makes the dialogue and the vocal sound a bit richer and fuller, basically. But never to the point when you turn and you go, "What am I hearing over here or there?" Because I never want that to happen. In that sort of, that's fine for other effects and things, but you don't want that to really happen in terms of just a dialogue vocal sound. Now, when it comes to the orchestra, I do specifically. I mean, you go to a big auditorium, Glenn, and there's a lot of speakers there in Atmos, all along the ceiling, in 2 rows, along the sides, around the back, everywhere. The music in this film comes out of every one of those speakers. Every single one of those speakers has music in it. You won't notice it in that way because, again, I want you to feel that there's the screen, there's the focus of our attention, but the width and the sort of for want of a better word, immersive style allows you to sort of feel that there's something around you, but you're not going to really perceive it. And for me, I like that style because then the sort of flashier moments are all about the sound effects, obviously, where you can really position things in the room in Atmos. But I love Atmos for music primarily because I want to get that sense of it being all around us. But I also love the fact that it's full range surrounds, which really, really helps music. It has a vibrancy that you only get in Dolby Atmos.
Well, we're coming to the end of our time, but as we wrap up, I just wanted to, sometimes I like to end these conversations by just asking for a quick round to go around with everybody. Just what's one particularly favorite sound moment in the film? Maybe something that just makes you feel a little all warm inside when you're at a screening and the one particular moment or a scene comes up. Nancy, you're smiling. Do you have something in mind?
My favorite to get a reaction from is definitely the bubble, because as focusing on the dialogue world, I don't usually get too creative, but I was very, very proud of the effect that we came up with for the bubble. And so the first time I saw it with an audience and just heard the first word she speaks inside the bubble gets a laugh, that tickles me. I love that.
There's so many sound moments in this film that I love, from the biggest to the smallest. I love how beautiful and simple and emotional the very opening of For Good is. I love Cynthia's performance in No Good Deed. I mean, that vocal of hers rocks. And to be able to fill it with such a big sound from the orchestra and a gigantic amount of sound effects from Jon, and yet she's still soaring above everything. I can watch that sequence and know that, honestly, I don't know what we could have done any better just to get her singing that song the way she does. It's a very proud moment, that one.
Well, on the music side, one thing I'm quite proud of is how we wrap things up in the film. I won't give too much away, but what I will say is that what we really, really struggled to try to find was a way tonally to finish the film without having the feeling of several endings in a row, I guess. It's almost impossible to top the impact of the song For Good. And yet we have 7 and change minutes of footage left in the film. So the way we were able to get around that challenge was to introduce a kind of almost contemporary approach to the music, which served to say, we're not getting in the way of the feelings that the audience is left with after For Good, but we're actually hoping to create a musical tone that in a way pushes the story into the future in a sense and gives the audience permission to sort of take it with them in a way that kind of sends them into a sort of questioning of what will the evolution of these characters be into the unknown. And so we did that by incorporating some synth elements and things that are not part of the tapestry of the score before it, but that give you that feeling of, oh, what's going to happen? This is almost like a new chapter that's beginning, even though we're at the end. So that took a lot of experimentation, but I think what we ended up with was a really innovative way to solve that narrative challenge.
It's tough. There's a lot of fun stuff that I really enjoyed. And I love Elphaba's cape. I just love the character of it. I love the quality of it. I love what it symbolizes. And I just love, it has so much movement. So there's so much nerdy little detail you can do, but it's just the quality of the sound is beautiful. I love the contrasting these big moments, tentpole kind of like songs, but I love in For Good. I love the way that we were able to kind of like bring the world, and we kind of like do these moments where we focus and the world kind of ebbs and flows, where we get into the realism and you can definitely feel the environment that they're in, but then we kind of like are able to subtly shift all that stuff away. But the girls are still living and breathing and operating in a world, but like that has just kind of really kind of recessed into the background. You're just focused on just their voices and the music. And I was really happy with how we were able to ride that line between realism and then the subjective nature of the emotional draw and the need in the story in those moments.
There's two. The first one is to just, to be so thankful that we had Robin Bainton and Nancy looking after the vocals and the dialogue, because on No Place Like Home, I had this fantastic Pat Peak lav on Cynthia, and that was like it's just sounded great. And then on the first rehearsal, it was obviously she's going to sing on the iconic Yellow Brick Road. We've got the keyboard accompaniment. It was a big, big moment for me. I knew that she was going to go very, very low in level in some places. I wanted to record with complete dynamic range. Halfway through the first rehearsal, she sits down as she's singing and takes the hat off. And so I knew
you lost your microphone.
Exactly. So, and obviously my MO is I just want to support these actors and their performances. I don't want to change anything. So we very quickly after the first rehearsal got a second lav onto the body. And every time she took it off, obviously I'm recording multi-tracks, but for Myron's mix track, every time she took it off, I was like, please take it off in between words so I can do a really neat crossfade, and just trying to look for that split second where I've got this moment where I can crossfade between two mics. And then she ends up in a static close-up where we crossfade onto another boom mic, which just sounded great. So it was just having that continuity of sound. But the second moment, which really is for me what I'm in this business for, was recording For Good itself. The first day we did all of the big sweeping crane shots. And then Jon said at the end of the day, listen, guys, we've got all of that. Tomorrow we've got to go tight. The first day, we really did lean on the lav mics, which sound great, but I couldn't get booms in at all. The second day, we went in so super close with the cameras, and I was able to have 2 digital Sherps boom microphones, both on cables, no radio links, and just really be able to mic them like an inch above their hairlines. And so when they're standing nose to nose and they're duetting with each other, I had two Sherpses which were almost touching each other with two boom operators. And I knew that there was going to be moments where even when Elphaba was singing, Jack and the team would go and use Ari's microphone and be able to have that balance and be able to use the best boom microphone for that moment in the duet. And just being able to give them that amount of choice on those close-ups with those really, really high quality AES mics was something special. And I came, not only did I have tears streaming down my cheeks as I was recording that song, but I came away from it thinking, from a technical perspective, we really, really nailed that. We've given the sound post and music post teams a wealth of choices.
I mean, let me just say that the recording of For Good is a masterclass in production sound recording. For months, we just had Simon's live track in the Avid, months and months, and it was like, don't touch this. We did a little bit of the work that Simon just described as we got further along in the process, but I've never been in a situation on a musical or on any other film where you don't need to I mean, it was truly impeccable, and you get that intimacy so convincingly in the musical number. Remarkable recording work done for that song and all the others, but that one in particular on this film is just, it's heartbreaking, largely because of their performance, but also because of how it was captured.
Having had this conversation with you guys last year, now talking about part two, Wicked for Good this time. And I got a chance to talk with Jon and Alice Brooks, the cinematographer, and it's so clear there's so much love between everybody on this crew. It seems like you guys went through a really magical experience for the past 2 or 3 years working on these two films. I hope you all get to work together again at some point soon, because it seems like something very special happened on these films.
Yeah, it's a precedent setting for sure. It's going to be hard.
I'm glad that comes across, because it's like literally every department, we have so much love and respect for each other. And Jon really, when he makes a film, he creates a little family, and this one is very, very special.
That's great. Well, thank you guys so much for taking the time and coming on the Dolby podcast today to talk to us about the work. And congratulations on the film. It's already proving to be a huge success. So
thank you,
Thanks,
Glenn.
Well done.
Yeah.
Well done.
Thanks, Glenn.
Many thanks to Simon, Nancy, Jon, Andy, and Jack for returning to the show today to discuss their incredible work on Wicked for Good. And an extra special thanks to our friends at Universal Pictures for helping us put this conversation together. And thanks to you for joining us today for this conversation about Wicked for Good. We want to know, what did you think of the film? Please leave a comment down below. We'd love to hear from you, especially all of you Wicked superfans. And if you are a superfan, today's episode is just one of several where we discuss the Wicked films. You can find links to all those other episodes, including 2 featuring director Jon M. Chu, in our show notes. Also in our show notes, you can find links to tickets to see Wicked for Good, now playing in theaters and Dolby cinemas in Dolby Vision and Dolby Atmos. And if you'd like even more conversations with artists and filmmakers about how they use technology to tell their stories, be sure you are subscribed to Dolby Creator Talks. If you'd like to check out our other episodes about Wicked, you can find all those links, including our episode with the original composer and lyricist of Wicked on Broadway, Stephen Schwartz, in our show notes. If you're curious to know more about what we do at Dolby Creator Lab, head on over to dolbycreatorlab.com. There you'll find information about all of our programs. You can access the entire library of episodes of the show, and you can sign up for our mailing list. Until next time, this is Dolby Creator Talks. I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. Our producer and editor is Michael Coleman. Our executive producers are Amanda Schneider and Jack Ferry, with additional editing by Matt Nixon. And our production coordinator is Karen Kahn. Thanks for joining us.